Good afternoon and welcome to the Education Funding webinar hosted by the Council of State Governments Eastern Region, or CSG East. For anyone unfamiliar with CSG, we're the nation's only nonpartisan organization serving all three branches of state government. We're composed of 4 regions, and CSG East serves U.S. states, Maryland up to Maine, U.S. Eastern Territories, and U.S. Eastern Canadian provinces. Today's program is presented jointly by the CSG East Education and Workforce Development Committee and the CSG East Fiscal Policy Committee. My name is Andrew Johnson. I'm a policy analyst at CSG, and I am your staff liaison for the Education and Workforce Development Committee. My counterpart, Chris, with our Fiscal Policy Committee, is unable to join us today as he recently welcomed a baby boy. We wish him the best and plenty of rest, although the latter may be wishful thinking. But today we're here to talk about education finance. We're going to hear from Michael Griffith, an education finance policy expert with the Learning Policy Institute, who will cover some of the basics and trends around this topic. Later, we'll hear from Ben Ike and Ian McKnight from the Levin Center for Legislative Oversight and Democracy, who will highlight some strategies lawmakers can use for oversight and any education finance initiative or policy. The goal for today is to equip state policymakers with the knowledge and tools to confidently approach issues in your respective jurisdictions around education and funding. With me today is our communications specialist, Dylan McDowell. He'll be monitoring the chat for questions and is available to assist with any technical issues should you encounter any. A few housekeeping items before we get started. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom. If you need any support in using the feature, please reach out to Dylan. We have a lot of good content to cover in this hour. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box at any time, but at this time I'll ask that we save the question period until the end after both presentations. Should we happen to go over on time and you need to leave, please know that we will have the recording online as soon as possible so you can catch anything you may have missed. With that, I would like to thank our speakers for joining us and sharing with us their expertise. I'll pass it on to Mike to briefly introduce himself and get the show started. Mike, this virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. My name is Mike Griffith. I work on school finance issues at the Learning Policy Institute. For those of you who don't know who LPI is, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that specializes in research and education policy. My role is simply to look at school funding, mainly at the state level and state funding formulas. And we work with different states at different times. We also write different papers on the topic. So today I've been asked to talk about what are some of the emerging issues. So if we can go to the first slide, Andrew. As it's coming up, let me just tell you, I wrote this 2 weeks ago. The world has changed in 2 weeks. It's one of these times where things are going to be changing a lot from week to week, both at the national level and at the state level. There are a lot of things happening, both with federal policy, but with the economy, with interest rates, with other things that are happening that are directly impacting school funding at the state level and district level. So if we can move to the next slide. With all that in mind, we're going to be talking about today some of the big topics. One of them we're going to hit on is the reduction in federal funding, which has hit a lot of states. The federal funds just ran out recently, so we're going to put that into context. One of the big issues that is out there impacting schools right now is declining student enrollment. And we're going to go through that, why it's important, what is it doing to schools, and then leave off with some positive news, what schools can do in difficult economic times. I'll also say that I know in school funding, most issues are state specific. So please feel free to ask state specific questions. I will say if you're from the provinces, I know some about Canadian school funding, but I would never say I'm an expert on it, but maybe we could have a discussion about that. I'd love to hear if you have questions. If we can go to the next slide. So these are some of the issues that are out there. You all know these issues. You've run into them. The loss of federal funding that we talked about, decreasing student enrollment. We'll talk more in depth about both of those. General inflation that is impacting schools across the board, both with salaries and benefits that they're paying. but also with other things like supplies and equipment, uh, the difficulty of retaining and recruiting qualified teachers. This has been an issue for years, but has come up even more so now. And ever increasing insurance costs, especially health insurance costs, uh, are pushing state budgets to the limit and in school district budgets. So these are things we know are issues, and quite frankly, some of them have been issues for a decade or two. But they're all kind of coming to a head right now. But there are some positives. One is the economy is doing well. I mean, you don't feel that way when you hear things, but unemployment is low. Wages are increasing for within states, which means a higher level of state tax revenue. Um, so in most states, we're looking at state budgets that are at least sort of break even and might be providing a little bit of extra money in the coming year. We're not seeing the large cuts that I think a lot of people were worried about during the 24-25 school year, and also the upcoming 25-26 school year is looking okay, not maybe great. And one of the positives, and we'll talk about this a bit more, but because we've had a couple of good years in a row, states and districts have been able to build up their reserve accounts. They've also been able to do some advanced purchasing on things. So they're not as in bad state as I would say we were looking at, say, in 2008, when that recession hit and a lot of places had not been able to build up their reserves beforehand. So they were kind of hit twice. They were hit with reductions in funding, and they were not able to kind of build up their and stabilize their budgets. We can move to the next slide. So this is just the ESSER funding. I'm not going to go too in depth in this because it is expired. Just to let you know, this was the largest single investment by the federal government in public education. It helped to stabilize budgets. It helped to provide additional funding for programs. But these dollars ran out on September 30th, 2024. For most places, you had to obligate the funding by then. And then you have until, what, 2 days ago now, that it had to be expended. There are some exceptions. Some states and districts were able to get extensions, but according to the federal government, it was very few that actually requested that and received that. So those monies are accounted for now for the most part, unless you were able to get an extension. If you can go to the next slide. So this is just, don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened. This money was positive money that really helped during a difficult time. It's gone now, but it did have positive influences, and hopefully will, for some districts and states, will continue to have some positive influence. If we could go to the next slide. Um, the funding was originally intended really for the additional cost due to COVID. And then even at that time, we were worried about a learning loss due to COVID. Those were the two primary reasons why all of this money was put into the system. It also eventually was being used to help offset decreasing enrollments, to allow for infrastructure improvements, especially HVAC or heating and air conditioning improvements within school districts and public schools, investment in technology, equipment, supplies. And then it was also used, and this was not its initial intent, but to replenish reserve accounts. And what a lot of districts did is they used these federal dollars to help fund programs, and then they moved money they would have used within their districts to their reserve accounts. So that the money was helpful for the last 3 years or so, but it can also be helpful in the future because it allowed for this replenishing of reserve accounts. So some positive news on that end. If we can go to the next slide, please. The places we are worried about are those districts that are heavily reliant on federal funding. And especially those places, and these tend to be low wealth areas that have a high percentage of Title I students that have an inability to raise funds locally. And even more so if they're in a state that has a flat or decreasing state funding for K-12. The places that are caught in that are really hit by this downturn, the loss of the federal dollars. So those are the places we're worried about. But I would say the vast majority of school districts we've been hearing are not hitting this kind of downturn we were worried about. There were some who thought that the loss of these federal dollars would be accompanied by decreases in state K-12 spending, and that double hit would really undercut public schools. The term some groups were using is there was going to be a bloodletting in the 24-25 school year. We have not seen that. That doesn't mean that some haven't been hurt. Again, it's these districts, but the majority of districts have kind of made it through with the loss of these dollars. We can go on to the next slide, please. So just to put this into context too, yes, it was a gigantic investment over time by the federal government. It was a 109% increase in federal funding during this time. At the same time, we did see increases from state and local funding. You can see it's 19.3% during this time at state and 17.4% for local. But the important thing is their inflation during that time was over 20%. So state funding and local funding did not keep pace with inflation. It was the federal dollars that helped make up this difference. When all of those are totaled, the total revenue for K-12 education during this time basically kept pace with inflation. So this belief that there was all of this spending and all this extra federal money really isn't true. The federal money allowed schools to keep pace with inflation during this time period. If we can go to the next slide, please. Now, declining student enrollment is a huge issue. It's been going on for a while. I'll show you that in some of the numbers. It's important in the context of school funding because most states base their state payments to districts off of enrollment counts or student attendance or membership counts. So when you lose students, you're going to lose state dollars. These losses tend to disproportionately hit lower wealth communities. And so what we've seen is it can hit, in some of these states, it's hitting every school district. We have seen after COVID a decline across the board in schools, but it's been disproportionate in larger urban areas and some small rural areas. When you lose these funds, people say, well, you're losing, 5% of your kids, you're losing 5% of your state funds, so it should offset each other. The problem is it takes 2 to 3 years to right size when you're losing students. You don't lose 5% of your kids all in a single grade. They are spread out over the 13 grades within your school district usually. So it takes a while for you to adjust your staffing to adjust for those numbers. The problem we're seeing is continual declining enrollment, which means it takes you 2 to 3 years to catch up, but you're always losing kids, so you're never catching up. And it's creating an issue. Plus, you have an excess capacity issue in school districts where you've built your school to serve, say, 500 kids. If it's serving 400, then 300, then 200, you have excess space and excess capacity for those kids that you're serving, but you're still paying for that space. If we can go to the next slide, please. And this just shows you what the enrollment numbers were from 2017-18 school year to the 22-23 school year. We saw a steady decline even before the COVID really kicked in, but it really accelerated in that after 2020. And so we've seen a reduction in change annually. We saw a little bit of a uptick recently, but it's still not showing that the majority of these kids have come back. I'll be honest, we do not know where these students have gone to. I know that sounds odd, but private schools have increased their enrollment, but only by a small amount. The demographics explain some of this. We were going to see a loss of some of these students, but for about 1 million of these students, we're not too sure where they're going. It could be that they're homeschooled. It could be something else. But if we can go to the next slide. And this is just something that NCSL put together. I think it's really interesting. And the main thing, I know it's kind of hard to see, but is in the upper right-hand corner there. The students that were lost were the youngest students. High school students, actually, enrollment continued to increase even during COVID. Middle school saw a drop, and then the youngest grade saw the largest drop. So it was a surprise to me. Some of this we sort of knew, that families were holding their kids back from kindergarten and maybe or preschool and putting them in a year later, kind of redshirting them. But it's more than that that's happened. And again, we're not too sure where these students are attending. We can go to the next slide. So what can we do during difficult times? One of the things we talk about is you can share services, especially for smaller school districts. If you're losing student enrollment, look and work with your neighboring school districts to share services, work with your local governments. There might be activities that they can do, or they might have additional funding for things like student programs that you can use for after school or summer learning, sharing resources. So if, for instance, if you're in a smaller school and you have a physics teacher, you might share that physics teacher online with a neighboring school district, and they can share maybe a math teacher with you to teach these courses online during the day. Um, Working with third parties like the Boys and Girls Club, United Way, and others. United Way works with a lot of school districts to provide after-school programs and summer learning programs, and also different intervention programs during the day. If you haven't tapped these, this is a good idea. Maximize the use of state and federal funding. This is something I think the vast majority of districts already do, but one of the things you can look at is Medicaid. Right now, you can use Medicaid dollars to help fund healthcare in your school district. A lot of districts do it, but not every district does it, or every charter doesn't, and it's something you could really look at. And finally, we talk about doing a community school approach. Community schools look at everything within the community and try to bring those services within the school. So that can be bringing in healthcare, bringing in dental services, bringing in different groups to help that work with young people. The research is showing that it's about a 6 or 7 to 1 dollar investment. For every dollar you put into a community school, they can bring in $6 or $7 of services and support from the community. So these tend to be a really good way to conserve dollars and provide additional services. And if we can go to the next slide. The other thing I'd say, if you do have additional dollars and it is something you're able to do, where you want to put the money to get the biggest bang for your buck is with high need student groups. And what we mean by high need student groups are those students from low income families, students who are English language learners, special education students, students are experiencing homelessness. These students need greater support to raise their test scores, and I'll show you in a second why it's so important to do that and why it's actually the best bang for your buck. And so if we go to the next slide, again, might be a little hard to read, but if you look here, the student center in the blue, this is students testing at basic or above on the 2022 test. For math and reading, you can see that the students who are not at risk and not English language learners test pretty well across the board. It's the other groups that are struggling right now. So the group to me, it's in the orange. I'm a bit colorblind, so I'm sorry, but it's the next tallest bar. Those are students who are from low-income families. The next group are students who are English language learners, and you can see the drop off in each of these categories. And the final group are students who are both English language learners and from low-income families. So you can see if you really want to move the needle in your state or your school district, it's going to be for these student groups. So putting additional supports for at-risk students, for English language learners, and for students who are experiencing both of those is really important right now. So we can go to the next slide. One last thing I'd like to say, finishing that off, within that at-risk group are these other categories, and I kind of skipped over this, but I should have mentioned it, are students experiencing homelessness, foster youth, and migrant students. And by migrant students, we mean students who move from district or school to school during the school year. There's a lot of research that shows for each of these groups, these students are moving around during the year. If you move twice or more during the school year, you see a very large drop off in student test scores, in attendance, and graduation rates. So putting additional resources towards these students is really important. And the gap between students experiencing homelessness and traditional at-risk kids is as big as the gap in learning between at-risk students and general ed kids. So it's very important for the small group of kids to provide these services and supports. So there you go. I hope I didn't depress all of you. There are still some positives out there. I'm more than happy to take any questions you have in general about school funding in the United States, or if you've got specific questions about your own funding system that I might be able to help with.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was very insightful. A little down and out, but it's there's also rebounding and places to go. So I didn't take it too bad myself. Um, we do have a little bit of time. We can maybe squeeze in one question if there's something pressing. But otherwise, I think we'll save about 10 minutes at the end for questions for both groups of presenters. So with that, I will go ahead and pass it to Ian and Ben. If you all don't mind to introduce yourselves quickly, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everybody. This is Ben Ike from the State Oversight Academy at the Levin Center. Great to be with all of you today. Ian?
And I'm Ian McKnight. I work alongside Ben, and together we are the training team with the State Oversight Academy at the Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy in Detroit, and I get to be in our New York office here, which is my own living room. But we're all over the country.
Yep, you see every corner of our New York City office. You can see every corner of it currently with Ian. So good to be here with you. Next slide. Just again, introductory slide. Next. So, with the time we have together, we're going to first just do a little bit of a further introduction on what the Levin Center is, what we're all about, and then specifically inside the Levin Center, the State Oversight Academy, and the work that we're doing. We'll give a kind of big picture breakdown on what even is legislative oversight and what we're talking about, linking that to appropriations for education and how some of the different tools for legislative oversight can help to equip all of you with the facts, the information that you need to be able to make as informed decisions as possible during budget seasons and even throughout, being able to monitor and track spending, making sure that we're really delivering implementation the way we intended. And then after that, there'll be some other recommendations, big picture recommendations on more oversight in your state, followed by I have two examples of what I saw as really strong examples of state oversight in two different states. So without any further ado, let's go to that next slide and get this thing rolling. So just to take a bit of a back step and just what even is the Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy. We are a kind of a three-legged stool at this point, where we have a Washington, D.C. office that does workshops and boot camps for congressional staff. And we've been doing that for about 10 years now, since Senator Levin retired. And we also have our state component, which is, 2/3 of it is me and Ian. And we get to travel all over the country and join on webinars like this to do workshops with committees, with caucuses, with different legislative staff on how to conduct legislative oversight. There's a couple of really great pictures. That one in the corner from Maine was just last week. Ian and I were out there. This was an interesting month for the SOA. I went from Portland to Portland. I was in Portland, Oregon, where I went down to Salem for a workshop, and then 2 weeks later I was in Portland, Maine. So I got a chance to see them both. We have a lot of good information on our website as well, lots of details on conducting different sorts of oversight, breaking things down by category. Definitely take a look. Hey, if you have any questions, you can always contact us. Next slide. Just a little bit more information on the Oversight Academy. One other item I really want to highlight is our Oversight Wiki. So if you go on our website, we have a wiki which is broken down into 50 different chapters, one for every state. And if you go in there, you can see your own committee oversight authority. You can see the different fiscal committees, given the appropriations topic today. And also we have an ability to be able to look at agency reports by topic. So let's say you're in a state and you have an education topic you really wish to pursue, but maybe at the moment you don't have a report that's on it for your particular state. You can go on our website and see if maybe there's a neighboring state or some other place that might have a little bit of information to get the ball rolling in your own state. Happy to navigate and show you a little bit more on the resource we have available there. A couple other things that we have coming up next week. We're very excited. We're launching our online oversight training program on February 5th. It's also my birthday, so that's very exciting. Happy to share more information about that another time. And then coming up in late June, we'll be in person in Detroit for our State Oversight Academy Symposium, which is practitioners and academics from across the country gathering and researching state legislative oversight together. Next slide. Ian?
So I'll take it from here. We are based in a law school, I believe Ben mentioned, in Detroit. And when you bring in people from a law school, we have to start by quoting the Supreme Court. So if we want to, and we'll talk now just about some of the basics of legislative oversight, and Ben will walk us through some examples of how this can be applied really well to education funding. But to understand legislative oversight in the states, we first have to look at Congress. The U.S. Constitution does not mention the word oversight at all. You can hit Control F on the National Archives website. You're not going to find it. But Article 2 does impose a duty on the president to faithfully execute the law. This implies in the lawmaking body, that is the legislative branch, to conduct inquiries to ensure that's happening. Oversight exists for the same reason that Congress has a library, which is that legislating is fundamentally an information problem. The more information you have and the better you're able to handle that information, the better you're able to legislate, to appropriate, and to otherwise monitor the implementation of government programs and other government operations. Presidents, executives have cooperated with oversight investigations of one kind or another since George Washington and General St. Clair's defeat at the Battle of Wabash. So oversight goes way back in American legislative tradition. The quote from the Supreme Court here, which dates to the early 20th century, but they most recently put in an opinion in 2020, is, "It is the proper duty of a representative body to look diligently into every affair of government and to talk much about what it sees. It is meant to be the eyes and voice and to embody the wisdom and will of its constituents." So today we'll talk about some of the practicalities involved with that. And we'll start with the next slide, which is what we call the cycle of accountability. So this is our very law school, pie in the sky vision of how oversight functions when things are working well. So when you're serving as a legislator, as the eyes and voice of the people, you're operating in this big cycle. It starts with recognizing a problem to be solved. You conduct some kind of investigation or inquiry. Maybe there are hearings, reports, letters of inquiry, subpoenas, or maybe it's much simpler. Those findings from what you investigate inform often some kind of legislation. The legislation, hopefully, if it's your legislation, becomes law. There's some sort of regulation or rules process that goes on, and then you move on to implementation. This is something that if you're in the legislature, you think of implementation perhaps as being a legislative branch, or excuse me, an executive branch sort of an activity. We want to challenge that today and tell you that in implementation, the legislative branch has a really important role to play. So you monitor that implementation, you get some kind of outcome, and the cycle starts again. Oversight and investigations. It's accountability between the legislative branch and the executive branch. And it's most importantly to the public, making sure government keeps its promises. We'll skip to the next slide here. And this is our vision of maybe how things, and perhaps this will be familiar to you. We've had states where we come in and we show this slide and people say, ah, yes, this is much more recognizable, where there's some sort of problem and you jump right to legislation. And next slide for me, please. The trouble is when we jump the gun on good oversight and jump straight to legislation, you really miss out. So it's really important that you add in oversight in all of these processes, that you're monitoring regulation and how rules are promulgated and all of that. So this is a really general orientation to how this all works. There are a number of powers you have to conduct good oversight if you're a legislator. Ben's going to tell us about those.
Thank you, Ian. So this is my favorite slide of the entire presentation. I think this is a really important way to be able to categorize all the different types of state legislative oversight. This was the result of research that Levin Center helped to lead back about 5 years ago, where we just wanted a baseline on just even state legislative oversight where we are today. And these are the 6 categories, the 6 avenues of state legislative oversight. So I won't spend a ton of time on this, but analytic bureaucracies is going to be also your oversight partners. So those are people like your state auditor or a legislative auditor, an ombuds, it could be a nonprofit partner, those different types of offices that exist to help to equip and get you facts, get you information. The one I will spend the most time on is going to be the second one, appropriation process. So this is the opportunity when the oversight authority, the leverage of the legislature is at its highest, is at its peak during the budget cycle. Use this opportunity to be able to use those annual budget hearings. A common complaint I hear across the country, a lot of those budget hearings are really not as informative as they ought to be. And we have a lot of different suggestions to be able to try to make, in some states like Pennsylvania, they're constitutionally required, and ways to be able to really, kind of box in and kind of make a narrative, make a really clear prioritization to the agencies that this is where I want the agency to look into, and this is what I want to be the thing that we look at for the next year, using that opportunity to be able to stake those priorities. Also, appropriations is a good opportunity to require reporting from a department or from an agency. In Michigan, we have something called boilerplate reporting, where back in the 2010s, when I was working in the Michigan legislature, I would use boilerplate reporting to require information on the Department of Corrections in Michigan. This is another way to be able to say, okay, you will receive your funding, but in order to receive the funding, you must provide to the policy chair, to the appropriations chair, maybe to leadership, the very specific types of data, information that you need to be able to make sure that the money that you're spending is being used in an effective and appropriate way. Also, I would think about, in the midst of a budget season and also from an education context, don't be afraid of a field trip. I would think that's doing, if you can, in your state, some sort of a subcommittee hearing. Do that at a school. Maybe if you want to prioritize special education funding, being able to do a hearing, have a chance to do that outside of the Capitol, bringing in various people that are doing this work every day could really provide some valuable insight on the day-to-day things that they're faced with. And that could help to have some more positive decisions when it comes time to think through funding and prioritization. Committees is typically the area of oversight people think of first when we bring up this topic. This would be not just appropriations, but also policy committees. And there are committees across the country that will put out reports on oversight. Committee hearings, of course, is another opportunity to conduct some oversight. They are also best used when they are performances, when there are opportunities to be able to put on record the information that's already known. It's not as effective if you use the hearing as your primary vehicle to gather facts. Administrative rule review is how the legislature can make sure that when laws are being implemented by the departments, that they're actually following the intent of the law. Back last summer in Oregon, I had a chance to see it live. I was pretty proud of it. There was a hearing that was held looking at a law that had already passed. It had passed about a year prior, for their Department of Education to develop a curriculum for a half a semester course for graduating high school seniors to take on personal finance. So the department had an initial plan for how they were going to do this course. They were going to try to incorporate it as part of an existing algebra class. And the legislature, when looking at that administrative rule, how the department was going to implement the law, the staff attorneys in the legislature reviewed that rule and determined that the plan from the department was not in compliance with the law, and that they needed to review and try again. And so they brought in the hearing, where the first part of the hearing was the staff attorneys for the legislature explaining that this is not in compliance with the intent of the law. And then the department came in after and explained the rationale for why they did it in the first place. And because they were given the heads up, they could pivot and start talking about what they were going to do to make things right. So that was a really nice example. Advising consent is going to be things like your gubernatorial appointees or addressing emergency orders. And then monitoring contracts. This is an area that's a bit short-suited across the country. I think it would be a wonderful opportunity for appropriations committees across the country to consider ways to further monitor contract implementation across the country, especially when you're dealing with high-dollar contracts or high-risk contracts involving vulnerable people. There's a lot of interesting approaches that are happening across the country on this issue, as we are seeing an expansion of more and more essential government services being provided by contract. Next slide. So now, if we kind of think like the overall narrative of the conversation we've had with me and with Ian, we talked about what even is legislative oversight. We talked about how it can happen on the previous slide with the 6 avenues. And now it's the what to investigate, the topics. So just a couple of ones. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but thinking about your own committee jurisdiction, of course, being able to think through the different topics you want to prioritize. We do an exercise called an oversight plan, where that's the whole first column. It's a big table, and you can think through the different topics you wish to pursue, and then we go from there. Think about if there's something that's in your news about education that's what you're faced with, and ways to be able to, show action in a legislature, getting facts, getting information on what happened. And then we mentioned the plan already, but a way to be able to sort of box everything into like a real meaningful, all right, here are the topics we're focused on, here are the questions we want answered, and this is how we're going to do it in the timeline. Doing that type of a plan will really set you up for success. Next slide. So now we have our different topics, and it's really important to think through, is this going to be routine or is this going to be event-driven oversight? Event-driven tends to be more of your firefighter. This is going to be times where there's something in the news, there's a disaster, something really bad is occurring, and you need answers right now to be able to find out what happened to make sure it does not ever happen again. That is a different skill set. That is an investigation. We usually talk about 4 different stages of investigations. Typically, when I'm thinking about it from an appropriations context, I think of routine oversight. There's ways to be able to look in the long term at the funding that is being given to different departments and thinking through, okay, how are the outcomes? How are we looking? What's going on with student standards? Are we reaching where we want to go? Are we not? Are there different sorts of funding priorities that we ought to pursue, because we'll end up being able to get more and more students to a point of success? Thinking through the routine versus the event-driven type of category for your oversight will also set you up for success. I believe it's back to Ian for the next slide.
Yes. So we talk a lot about, in everything we've discussed, we speak about these larger institutions and these bigger oversight plans, and we're going to speak a little bit more about that. But before we do, I want to convince you first that if you are a state legislator or a member of legislative staff, you also have some oversight superpowers that don't necessarily involve holding a big hearing, writing a big report, convincing an auditor to look into something. Even in your capacity as a singular person, you really have some built-in power to do basic oversight work. The amazing benefit of a legislative office, and Ben and I are both legislative staff alumni. The great benefit of a legislative office is that your phone calls and emails get returned. Your questions can trigger investigations and reports, and reconsideration and change. And you're looking into things, you're acting as the eyes and voice of your constituents can on its own make as much or more impact than legislation. Constituent service is one of my favorite things to talk about in this context. Constituent service exists as part of the American legislative tradition because it is oversight. Constituents call your office when systems fail. Probably many of you who are watching, who are in legislative positions, have a great familiarity with a lot of the higher level educators in your district, the principals, the superintendents. Visiting facilities is really great oversight as well. In the office where I used to work during the month of March, coming up, March is reading month, we would visit every school in the district. That's a great thing to do, number one, to tell school kids about government and to get them excited about reading. But it's also a really great chance to go and see how things are looking in schools, how programs are being implemented, what is the feeling among administrators and among educators about what's going on at the State House. So that's a really great opportunity. You can also, many of you are in states where the rules permit you to hold committee hearings in places other than your typical committee room. So don't be afraid to get out and hold hearings in schools. Though do be aware, elementary schools have really tiny, uncomfortable chairs for hearings, something to keep in mind. We'll move on to the next slide here, and I want to just breeze through this material rather quickly because we have some exciting stuff to get to that's a little more education specific. But those of you who have done Levin Center workshop before will be familiar with the 4 phases of an investigation, which when we are looking at a really serious oversight issue, you start with fact-finding. There are different ways of acquiring information. Many of you are in states where you have some sort of oversight partner, program evaluators, auditors, that sort of thing, and really sweeping powers of inquiry. You can issue subpoenas or threaten to do so. So you start off by finding facts, pulling data together. You may put together some kind of written product. You may have staff do that for you. And only then do you hold a hearing where you, as Ben mentioned earlier, use the hearing not to find facts, that's already happened, but to put the facts on the record using theater and story to build a compelling narrative. This is a really powerful policy-making tool. Especially in state government where things tend to be a little bit more concrete than what's going on in federal government. You're dealing with real people and real problems. So hearings can be a super powerful tool. And then there's a follow-up aspect as well, holding people to their promises, calling folks back in, monitoring implementation over time. So that's our really quick introduction to investigations. One thing I do want to show you, which is on the next slide, is, and we spend a ton of time with this in our longer programs because it's one of the most important focusing things you can do in conducting oversight. In any investigation or really in smaller scale, what's going on here sorts of operations, is really important to be guided by what we call a factual question. This is really helpful as you're thinking about developing your oversight plans for the year. It's really helpful as you're starting to ask questions as you begin appropriating money in certainly the education world, but really anywhere else in state government. A factual question is a North Star of your work, but the best ones allow a little space for your investigation to change over time. Ben's going to walk through a couple examples in a moment, and what you'll notice is that these are really chasing after an answer to one of these sort of factual questions. So it's easy for you to ask, why are the schools so bad in the rural areas of my state? But that, number one, has a sort of built-in assumption about this is the case, the schools there are worse, and I want to figure out why. And it has a prejudgment. So you set out and already you're trying to prove a hypothesis. So what you might be better off asking is, how do outcomes for students receiving special education services vary across the state? It allows you to zoom in on a particular program, and there's no prejudgment included in that question. Senator Levin, our namesake, who was on the permanent subcommittee on investigations in the United States Senate for a long, long time, his staff tell a story about an investigation they did where they were looking at oil spills in the Great Lakes. And you can ask, how come we don't have bigger fines for shipping companies responsible for oil spills? And you have all kinds of assumptions built into this question about the shipping companies are responsible and the problem is the fines are too low. If you are just looking to jump right to legislation, you've done it there with that question. But what they asked instead was, what kind of oil spills happen in the Great Lakes and how are they handled? And what they discovered as a result of that was not that, as they had assumed, the oil spills were coming from tankers on the Great Lakes. It turned out those spills were coming from land-based facilities, those oil refineries in northern Indiana, for those of you who have taken the train into Chicago. Those were the source of the oil spills. So by zooming out and by asking a more open-ended factual question, they left room to discover a problem that they did not anticipate was the problem that changed the course of the investigation in a useful and meaningful way. So Ben's going to come back now and tell you about just a few more practical recommendations, and then I think we'll get into some examples.
Thanks, Ian. So these are just really big picture recommendations. If you're, listening to what we're talking about and saying, yes, I want to discover how I can strengthen oversight in my own state. We recommend joint oversight committees with a balanced party membership. It helps to, establish more credibility to everything the committee does for the purpose of fact finding. I discussed also this idea of trying to include more contract oversight. I think that's something that could also be very relevant for appropriation audiences. And also, thinking about your outcomes, post things online, status of what you're pursuing and what the results are, what are your findings. Doing that will help to kind of create also a little bit of a trajectory on some of these issues that have just chronically been a problem in not just education, but in other issues for years and years in your state. Being able to really show the context of the years and years of effort that's happened in the legislature to try to improve a problem, what's worked, what's gotten us closer. It kind of helps also to be able to build up this sort of institutional expertise of knowing where we are and where we need to go. So at this time, I want to spend the remainder of my time discussing two examples that I thought were particularly strong from across the country. These are both performance audits from legislative audit offices. I'm going to start off with Kansas. Kansas Legislative Division of Post Audit is one of the stronger oversight partners that we've seen across the country. They're pumping out great reports on all sorts of topics. And the one I want to focus on briefly here is one that they did on estimating the cost of K-12 education. So they started with wanting to understand from a fiscal context, how much money would Kansas theoretically have to give to education to have every single student in Kansas meet state standards? They had a lot of difficulty being able to determine that number. In fact, they said there probably isn't an exact number that would work from a big, just broad giving more money to public education as a whole. However, what it did find was that there were very specific little categories where if you gave money to certain things, then you would see more students reaching that state standards. So some of the different topics that they were encouraging for increased funding were things like teacher pay or more money for more books. Things along those lines were seen as improving the number of students meeting state standards. I also, in their report, I liked some of the different visuals that they used. I really get excited when I see audit reports of visuals. They just help me. And the one on the right is looking at how if you increase your spending by a percentage, the number of students within certain disadvantaged categories would be reaching standards as a result of it. So they were able to really narrow down the focus to be able to show the impact of the dollar. What was also interesting, post audit does have the ability to offer recommendations to the legislature. They did not in this one particular example, but they can. And the other reason why this was really a best practice to me was they have a podcast inside Post Audit called The Rundown. And they're on their website. It's a little over 20 minutes long, is an interview with the analysts that did this audit. And it's a fascinating listen because not only do you have just, they're not just reciting the numbers, the results. They really go into some of the challenges they had throughout the audit, some of the difficulties they had when they were running into areas of subjectivity. It's a really interesting, positive listen, and it's a good way, for legislators who are often on the road to be able to get something to listen. It's another great way to be able to deliver information to busy people. So that's one of the strong examples that I wanted to share. And the next one, I'm going to go to the Pacific Northwest to Washington State. So this is JLARC, JLARC, the Washington State Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee. And this is a brand new report that came out from their Legislative Audit Office, came out this month. And this was a comprehensive dive into funding formulas and spending for special education in every district in Washington. So I like this visual on this graph where it shows every blue dot on this chart is a school district in Washington, and it shows on average like this funding for special education. So you can see on that far left side, there was a district that's spending a little less than $5,000 per student, and then way over on the right, just shy of $20,000 per student in a different district. really kind of gives a good visual for the spread of spending. And unlike Kansas, this report did take the step forward and make a recommendation that there needs to be more clarity and maybe even a change to the funding formula for special education in Washington State to be able to really make sure that the districts are getting access to the resources they need to be able to help to empower students with IEPs to be able to achieve their best outcomes. It's a very strong report. What I also like about it, I mean, they do have on their website say it's a one-page summary. Now, I think they were generous here because it's 2 pages. I mean, maybe they print it on the front and the back, but it is a very succinct summary on some of the highlights of the different facts they discovered and some of the recommendations to the legislature for next steps. And then they have the full report also available online, much more comprehensive, breaking down all the different ways they were looking at special education funding in Washington State. I believe those were the two I wanted to share at this moment. I believe both of these are very strong examples of how an oversight partner, in this case it was their legislative auditors, were able to use the power of their offices, of their time, to get information, to prioritize certain topics within education appropriations. And then the legislature and the appropriations committees can pick it up and they can use this type of facts. So you can use this information to make for a stronger public education system in your state. I really appreciate you all. Thank you for taking your time with us. And if you have more questions, any more information, that's both of our contact information. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Well, thank you both for that very insightful and thorough presentation on how state lawmakers can utilize oversight to track and monitor how they're spending in education and ask the right questions and, really get the most bang for their buck and adapt over time. That's very, it resonated with me, the example about the inter branch cooperation, because that's what we love to see when it's in a positive note like that of two branches working together to get to the right outcome. So great, thank you all. Well, that brings us to the final portion, the Q&A. Correct me if I am wrong, Dylan. I don't see any questions in the chat at the moment, but I will open it up if anybody has any questions. And if the awkward silence is too much, if our presenters have anything else they'd like to add to fill in the gaps if you're typing, I'm happy to facilitate that as well. All right, it's been a while since I've been in the classroom, but I think I reached that 30-second threshold. I probably should go longer for Zoom, but the sound of my computer is making me anxious. So, all right, well, if there are no more questions, and I'll keep an eye out as I close out just to make sure. But I do want to thank you all again for attending, and of course, thanks to our panelists for presenting. They sent their contact info. We'll have the recording out and the slides so you can get their contact info if you need it. I also would like to give a special thanks to Dylan and Chris at CSG East for helping in preparing this webinar and doing a lot of the back end work. It's very meaningful and helpful. So if you have any questions, please reach out. If you have any comments, any feedback moving forward of anything you'd like to see more in depth, anything else related to education finance you want us to cover in the future, please send that my way and we will be sure to find a way to get you the resources that you need. So with that, thank you all for joining. That concludes our webinar. Have a wonderful rest of your day and good session.
Take care.